Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite restaurant, and the waitress serving your coffee is 9 months pregnant. 9 months. She's smiling, taking orders, refilling water glasses, all while carrying a baby that could arrive any moment. You might think she's crazy for working so late in her pregnancy. But what if I told you she had no choice? What if I told you that this pregnant waitress was working until her very last day, not by choice, but out of pure necessity? And what if I told you that when her customers discovered the real reason why she couldn't stop working, they did something that changed her life forever? Something that turned a story of struggle into a miracle that will restore your faith in humanity. This is the story of Maria Santos, a 26-year-old waitress who worked until the day she gave birth, and the customers who discovered her secret and created a fund that raised over $2 million. Before we dive into this incredible journey, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment below telling us about a time when strangers showed you unexpected kindness. Now, let me tell you about Maria and the miracle that happened at Rosie's Diner. Main script content. Maria Santos had been a waitress at Rosie's Diner in downtown Phoenix for 3 years when she discovered she was pregnant. At 26 years old, she had worked her way up from buzzer to head waitress at the small family restaurant that served the best comfort food in the neighborhood. The news of her pregnancy should have been a moment of pure joy. But instead, Maria found herself staring at the positive pregnancy test with a mixture of happiness and overwhelming fear. You see, Maria was a single mother. Her boyfriend had left when she was just 8 weeks along, disappearing without so much as a goodbye note or explanation. One day he was there, talking about their future together. And the next day his apartment was empty and his phone was disconnected. Maria was completely alone, facing the prospect of raising a child by herself while working a job that barely covered her rent and basic expenses. But Maria Santos was not the type of person to give up. She had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador when she was 19 years old, speaking very little English, and carrying nothing but a small suitcase and determination that burned like fire in her chest. She had worked 3 jobs while learning English at night school, sent money back to her elderly parents, and slowly built a life for herself in America. This baby, she decided, would not break her. This baby would make her stronger. As the months passed and her pregnancy progressed, Maria continued working at Rosie's Diner with the same dedication and warm smile that had made her a favorite among regular customers. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and never let on that she was struggling financially. The only person who knew the full extent of her situation was Rose Martinez, the 68-year-old owner of the diner, who had become like a grandmother to Maria. Rose had watched Maria work through morning sickness, hiding her nausea behind bright smiles, as she served plates of eggs and bacon. She had seen Maria's uniform gradually get tighter, watched her move a little slower, noticed how she would sometimes place her hand on her lower back and wince when she thought no one was looking. Rose offered Maria time off, offered to reduce her hours, but Maria always politely declined. "I need to work, Miss Rose," Maria would say in her soft accent. "The baby needs things, and I need to save money for when I cannot work after the birth." What Rose didn't know, what none of the customers knew, was just how desperate Maria's situation had become. Her apartment rent had increased by $400 a month when her lease renewed, and her old car had broken down, requiring expensive repairs that ate up what little savings she had managed to accumulate. Maria was living paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes not even that. There were nights when she would eat nothing but saltines and water, so she could save money for prenatal vitamins and doctor visits. Maria had applied for government assistance, but the process was slow and complicated, and the amount she might receive wouldn't be enough to cover her basic needs, let alone prepare for a baby. She looked into second jobs, but no one wanted to hire a visibly pregnant woman for physical work. She considered moving to a cheaper apartment, but she had already moved twice in the past year, each time to smaller and less safe neighborhoods, and she was afraid to go any lower. So Maria made a decision that many people would consider impossible. She would work until the very last day possible. She would work until her body absolutely could not work anymore. She would save every penny she could, deny herself every comfort, and push through whatever pain or exhaustion came her way. For her baby, she would do anything. By her 8th month, of pregnancy. Maria was a sight that made customers do double takes when they walked into Rosie's diner. Her belly was round and prominent, but she still moved between tables with grace, still remembered everyone's coffee preferences, still had a genuine smile for every person who walked through the door. She had developed a way of carrying trays that accommodated her changing body, and she had learned to take breaks by pretending to organize menus or check inventory. The regular customers at Rosie's diner were a mix of working-class folks, retirees, and local business people who had been coming to the restaurant for years. They knew Maria's name. They asked about her pregnancy, and they always left good tips because they could see how hard she worked. But none of them realized that beneath Maria's cheerful exterior was a young woman who was absolutely terrified about her future. There was Tom Bradley, a 70-year-old retired construction worker who came in every morning at 7:30 for coffee and wheat toast. There was Linda Chun, a 58-year-old nurse who stopped by after her night shifts at the hospital. There was Father Miguel Rodriguez from the local Catholic church, who would come in on Tuesday afternoons for lunch and always ask Maria how she was feeling. There were dozens of other regulars, people who had watched Maria's belly grow over the months and had made jokes about her working until the baby decides to join them for breakfast. They had no idea how close to the truth those jokes really were. It was a Thursday morning in late September when everything changed. Maria was 39 weeks pregnant, and her doctor had warned her that the baby could come at any time. She had been having irregular contractions for several days, but they weren't consistent enough to be real labor, so she continued working. That morning, she was serving coffee to Tom Bradley when she suddenly stopped mid, her face going pale as she placed her free hand on her belly. Tom, who had raised 5 children with his late wife, recognized that look immediately. "Maria, sweetheart," he said gently, "are you having contractions?" Maria took a deep breath and smiled, though Tom could see the strain in her eyes. "Just practice ones, Mr. Tom. The doctor says they're normal, but Tom Bradley had been around enough pregnant women to know the difference between Braxton Hicks contractions and the real thing. He watched Maria carefully as she continued her rounds, noticing how she would pause and breathe deeply every few minutes, how she gripped the edge of tables when she thought no one was looking. During her lunch break, Maria sat in the back booth with a glass of water, trying to decide if she should call her doctor. The contractions were getting stronger and more regular, but they were still 15 minutes apart. Her doctor had told her to come to the hospital when they were 5 minutes apart, or when her water broke. She still had time, she told herself. She could finish her shift. Linda Chun, the nurse, came in around 2 o'clock for her usual late lunch after her night shift at the hospital. She immediately noticed that Maria looked uncomfortable and was moving differently than usual. When Maria brought her order, Linda gently asked, "How far apart are your contractions, honey?" Maria was startled. "How did you know?" "I'm a labor and delivery nurse," Linda said with a kind smile. "I can tell." "How far apart?" "About 10 minutes now," Maria admitted. "But I can finish my shift. I need to work today." Linda's expression grew concerned. "Maria, you need to go to the hospital. 10-minute contractions mean you're in early labor." "I know," Maria said, tears forming in her eyes. "But I can't afford to leave early. I need every hour of work I can get before the baby comes. I won't be able to work for weeks after the birth, and I need the money." It was at that moment that Linda Chun understood something that broke her heart. This young woman wasn't working because she was dedicated or because she loved her job. She was working because she was desperate. She was working because she had no choice. "Maria," Linda said softly, "sit down for a minute. Tell me what's really going on." And for the first time in 9 months, Maria Santos broke down. Sitting in that back booth at Rosie's diner, with contractions coming every 10 minutes, Maria told Linda the truth about her situation. She told her about being abandoned by her boyfriend. She told her about the rent increase and the broken-down car. She told her about the nights when she ate nothing but crackers because she was saving money for baby supplies. She told her about her fear that she wouldn't be able to provide for her child. "I have maybe $800 saved," Maria whispered through her tears. "That's supposed to last me until I can come back to work. The doctor says I need at least 6 weeks to recover, but I don't have insurance that covers maternity leave. I don't know how I'm going to pay rent or buy formula or diapers. I have to work until I absolutely cannot work anymore." Linda Chun had been a nurse for 35 years. She had seen poverty, she had seen struggle, and she had seen young mothers face impossible situations. But something about Maria's story, something about her dignity and determination, even in the face of such hardship, moved Linda in a way she had never experienced before. "You're going to the hospital right now," Linda said firmly. "I'm driving you there myself, and I'm not taking no for an answer. 10-minute contractions mean that baby could come today." Maria started to protest, but another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones, and she gripped the edge of the table until it passed. Linda went to find Rose Martinez and quickly explained the situation. Rose, who had been worried about Maria for weeks, immediately agreed that Maria needed to go to the hospital. She promised Maria that her job would be waiting for her when she was ready to come back, no matter how long it took. As Linda helped Maria gather her things and prepare to leave for the hospital, something extraordinary began to happen. Tom Bradley, who had been watching the situation unfold from his usual booth, approached them. "Is everything all right?" he asked, with genuine concern. Linda looked at Maria, who nodded permission for her to explain. In simple terms, Linda told Tom about Maria's situation, about how she had been working while in labor because she couldn't afford to stop. Tom Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out all the cash he had with him, about $60, and pressed it into Maria's hand. "For the baby," he said gruffly, his eyes moist. "Every child deserves a good start." Within minutes, word had spread around the small diner. The handful of customers who were there that afternoon learned about Maria's situation, and something beautiful began to happen. People started reaching into their wallets and purses. They started pulling out 20s and 50s and 100s. By the time Linda was ready to drive Maria to the hospital, there was over $400 in cash that the customers had spontaneously contributed. But that was just the beginning. Father Miguel Rodriguez had come in just as Maria was leaving for the hospital. When he heard what was happening, he made a decision that would change everything. He asked Rose if he could have Maria's full name and contact information because he wanted his congregation to pray for her during this time. What Father Rodriguez didn't tell anyone was that he was planning to do much more than pray. That Sunday, Father Rodriguez stood before his congregation at St. Mary's Catholic Church and told them about Maria Santos. He told them about a young woman who had worked until she went into labor, not out of choice, but out of necessity. He told them about someone who exemplified the values of hard work, determination, and sacrifice for family that their community held dear. This young woman represents the best of what it means to be human. Father Rodriguez told his parishioners she represents dignity in the face of hardship and love that overcomes fear. She worked until her body could work no more, all for the love of a child she had never met. If that is not a miracle, if that is not something sacred, then I don't know what is. Father Rodriguez announced that the church would be taking up a special collection for Maria and her new baby. He provided information for people who wanted to contribute beyond what they could give that Sunday. He also mentioned that Maria was a waitress at Rosie's Diner for anyone who wanted to visit and offer their support directly. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week the church had collected over $8,000 for Maria and her baby. But the story was just getting started. Linda Chun, the nurse who had driven Maria to the hospital, couldn't stop thinking about the young mother. She had visited Maria several times since the birth, bringing baby supplies and helping with groceries. Maria had given birth to a healthy baby girl named Isabella, and she was recovering well physically. But Linda could see the stress and worry in Maria's eyes every time they talked about the future. Linda decided to do something she had never done before. She created a GoFundMe account for Maria Santos and her baby Isabella. Linda was not particularly tech-savvy, and she had never used crowdfunding before, but she felt compelled to try to help Maria in a bigger way. She wrote a simple, heartfelt description of Maria's situation, explaining how this hard-working young mother had been forced to work until she went into labor because she had no other choice. She included information about Maria's character, her work ethic, and her dedication to providing for her child. Linda's initial goal was modest. She hoped to raise maybe $5,000 to help Maria through her first few months as a new mother. She shared the GoFundMe link with her coworkers at the hospital, posted it on her personal Facebook account, and asked a few friends to share it. She also left printed information about the fundraiser at Rosie's Diner for customers who might be interested in helping. The response was unlike anything Linda could have imagined. Within 24 hours, the GoFundMe had raised over $10,000. Within a week, it had reached $50,000. The story of Maria Santos and her determination to work until the very last moment was being shared across social media platforms, picked up by local news outlets, and spreading far beyond Phoenix, Arizona. People from all over the country were contributing to Maria's fund. They were sharing their own stories of struggle and perseverance. They were talking about times when they had to make impossible choices between financial security and personal well-being. Maria's story was resonating with people because it represented something universal about the human experience. The lengths we will go to provide for the people we love. The local television news station, Channel 12, reached out to Linda Chun for an interview about the fundraiser. The story aired on a Tuesday evening, featuring an interview with Linda, footage of Rosie's diner, and a brief phone conversation with Maria, who was still recovering at home with baby Isabella. That news story changed everything. By Wednesday morning, the GoFundMe had received contributions from people in 47 different states. The fund had grown to over $100,000, and it was increasing by thousands of dollars every hour. Maria's story was being shared by celebrities on social media, picked up by national news outlets, and discussed on morning talk shows. But perhaps more importantly, Maria's story was inspiring other acts of kindness in communities across the country. People were looking around their own neighborhoods for pregnant mothers who might be struggling. They were organizing support for single parents in their communities. They were starting conversations about maternity leave policies and support systems for working mothers. The manager of a major baby supply company in California saw Maria's story and decided to donate a complete nursery set, including a crib, changing table, stroller, car seat, and 6 months' worth of diapers and formula. A children's clothing manufacturer in Texas contributed a year's worth of baby clothes in various sizes. A financial planning company offered to provide free financial counseling to help Maria manage her newfound resources wisely. Rose Martinez, the owner of Rosie's Diner, was amazed by the attention her small restaurant was receiving. People were driving from other cities just to eat at the place where Maria had worked, wanting to be part of the story in some small way. Rose decided to use the increased business to create a scholarship fund for single mothers in the community who are pursuing education or job training. Tom Bradley, the retired construction worker who had been the first to contribute money that day at the diner, became something of a local celebrity. Reporters interviewed him about what had motivated him to help Maria, and his simple answer resonated with people everywhere. "She was working hard and needed help," Tom said. "That's all I needed to know. When you see someone doing their best in a tough situation, you help them if you can. That's just what decent people do." As the GoFundMe campaign continued to grow, Linda Chun found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing such a large fundraiser. She reached out to a local attorney who volunteered to help structure the fund properly to ensure that Maria would receive the maximum benefit and that all tax and legal requirements were met properly. By the end of the second week, Maria's fund had reached $500,000. By the end of the month, it had surpassed $1 million. The story of the pregnant waitress who worked until her last day had touched hearts around the world, with contributions coming from as far away as Australia, Germany, and Japan. Maria Santos, who 6 weeks earlier had been terrified about how she would provide for her baby, now found herself in a position she had never imagined possible. She had enough money to take proper time off to bond with Isabella and recover from childbirth. She had enough money to go back to school and pursue the nursing degree she had always dreamed of but never thought she could afford. She had enough money to provide Isabella with opportunities that Maria herself had never had as a child. But perhaps, most importantly, Maria had something she had never expected to find: a community of people who cared about her well-being and wanted to see her succeed. The letters and messages that accompanied the donations were almost as valuable to Maria as the money itself. People shared their own stories of struggle and triumph. They offered encouragement and advice. They told Maria that her strength and determination had inspired them to persevere through their own difficulties. A grandmother from Ohio wrote, "Your story reminded me of my own struggles as a young single mother 40 years ago. I wish I had had the community support that you're receiving now. Use this blessing to build a beautiful life for you and your daughter." A young father from Florida contributed $50 and wrote, "I'm a new dad myself, and I can't imagine having to face what you faced alone. Your courage amazes me. I hope my daughter grows up to be as strong as you are." A retired teacher from Michigan sent $100, along with a note, "I taught for 37 years, and I met many students whose mothers were heroes, just like you. Thank you for showing the world what real strength looks like." The stories and messages kept coming, each one reminding Maria that her experience had touched something deep in the human spirit, something that transcended geography and demographics and connected people through their shared understanding of love, struggle, and hope. 3 months after Isabella's birth, Maria returned to work at Rosie's Diner. She didn't have to return to work. The fundraiser had provided her with enough financial security to take as much time off as she wanted. But Maria chose to return because Rosie's Diner had become more than just a workplace to her. It had become the center of a community that had embraced her and Isabella in ways she was still trying to understand. However, Maria's return to work was different this time. Rose Martinez had used the increased business from the publicity to expand the restaurant and hire additional staff, which meant that Maria could work part-time hours that allowed her to spend more time with Isabella. Maria was also enrolled in online classes toward her nursing degree, a dream that was now financially possible thanks to the generosity of strangers. The regular customers at Rosie's Diner were thrilled to see Maria back, and many new customers came specifically because they had heard her story and wanted to meet her in person. Maria was initially uncomfortable with the attention, but she gradually came to understand that her story had given people something they needed: proof that kindness and community still existed in the world. Linda Chun, who had started the GoFundMe campaign, remained actively involved in Maria's life. She became Isabella's honorary grandmother, babysitting when Maria had classes or needed to study. Linda often reflected on how a simple act of compassion had grown into something that impacted thousands of people around the world. Father Miguel Rodriguez incorporated Maria's story into his sermons about community and caring for one another. The special fund that his church had created for single mothers had grown into a permanent program that provided ongoing support for families in need throughout the Phoenix area. Tom Bradley, the retired construction worker who had been the first to help Maria that day, became a regular volunteer at a local women's shelter, helping to provide practical support for mothers facing difficult circumstances. When reporters asked him about his increased involvement in community service, aside simply "Maria showed me that there are people all around us who need help." Once you start looking, you can't stop seeing the opportunities to make a difference. The impact of Maria's story extended far beyond individual acts of kindness. Several companies reviewed their maternity leave policies after learning about her situation. A national restaurant chain implemented a program to provide emergency financial assistance for employees facing unexpected hardships. A major corporation created a fund specifically designed to support single mothers who were pursuing education while working. Politicians began discussing the need for better support systems for working mothers, and advocacy groups used Maria's story to illustrate the gaps in social safety nets that leave vulnerable families in impossible situations. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the hundreds of thousands of people who had contributed to Maria's fund or simply heard her story. They had been reminded of their own capacity for compassion and their connection to the struggles and triumphs of others. In a world that often seemed divided and disconnected, Maria's story had created a moment of unity around the simple truth that everyone deserves support and compassion during their most difficult times. 1 year after Isabella's birth, Linda Chun organized a celebration at Rosie's Diner to mark the anniversary of the GoFundMe campaign. The event was attended by many of the people who had been part of Maria's story from the beginning: Rose Martinez, Tom Bradley, Father Miguel Rodriguez, and dozens of the regular customers who had witnessed Maria's determination and contributed to her support. Maria spoke briefly at the celebration, holding Isabella in her arms as she thanked the community that had embraced them both. "A year ago, I was terrified about the future," Maria said, her voice steady but emotional. "I was working until the very last moment because I didn't see any other choice. I never could have imagined that my situation would lead to so much kindness from so many people. You didn't just help me and Isabella financially. You showed us that we were not alone in the world. You taught us that there are good people everywhere who care about each other's well-being. That lesson is worth more than any amount of money." Maria went on to explain how she was progressing toward her nursing degree and how she planned to specialize in labor and delivery nursing so she could support other mothers facing difficult circumstances. "I want to be for other women what Linda was for me that day," Maria said, smiling at Linda Chun, who was wiping tears from her eyes. "I want to see when someone needs help and be brave enough to offer it. I want to pass on the kindness that all of you have shown to me and Isabella." Isabella, now a healthy and happy 1-year-old, gurgled happily in her mother's arms, unaware that she was at the center of a story that had touched hearts around the world. As the celebration continued, people shared stories about how Maria's experience had inspired them to look for opportunities to help others in their own communities. They talked about volunteer work they had started, charitable contributions they had made, and simple acts of kindness they had performed because they had been moved by Maria's story. Rose Martinez announced that Rosie's Diner would be establishing an annual scholarship for single mothers pursuing education, funded by a percentage of the restaurant's profits. She also revealed that the diner would be offering paid maternity leave for all female employees, regardless of their length of employment. Linda Chun shared that she had been contacted by healthcare systems across the country who wanted to implement programs to identify and support patients who were facing financial hardships. She had become an unofficial consultant on community-based support systems for vulnerable families. Tom Bradley, now 73 years old, had become a mentor figure for several young fathers in the community, offering practical advice and emotional support to men who were facing the challenges of parenthood. Father Miguel Rodriguez announced that his congregation's support program for single mothers had assisted over 50 families in the past year and was being replicated by churches in other cities. The celebration at Rosie's Diner that day was more than just a party. It was a demonstration of how one person's courage and a community's compassion could create ripple effects that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Maria found herself standing outside the diner with Isabella, looking up at the stars in the clear Arizona sky. She thought about how different her life was now compared to that day a year ago, when she had been working through contractions, terrified about the future and feeling completely alone. Linda Chun joined her outside, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a few moments. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't been working that day I came in?" Linda asked. Maria considered the question. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "But I also think that everything happened the way it was supposed to happen. I needed to learn that I wasn't alone, but I also needed to learn that I was strong enough to handle whatever came my way." Both of those lessons were important. Linda nodded thoughtfully. "Your story changed a lot of lives, Maria, including mine. I had become cynical about people, about whether anyone really cared about anyone else anymore. Watching how people responded to your situation restored my faith in humanity." Maria shifted Isabella to her other arm and smiled. "I used to think that asking for help was a sign of weakness," she said. "Now, I understand that accepting help is actually a form of strength. It takes courage to let people care about you, and giving help is just as important for the person giving as it is for the person receiving." As Maria walked home that night, pushing Isabella's stroller through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a terrified pregnant woman working until the very last moment out of desperation. She had become a symbol of determination and resilience for people around the world. But most importantly, she had learned that she was part of a human community that was capable of extraordinary kindness when people chose to see and respond to each other's needs. The story of Maria Santos and the pregnant waitress who worked until her last day became more than just a heartwarming news story. It became a reminder of the power of human connection and the importance of paying attention to the struggles of the people around us. It demonstrated that small acts of compassion could grow into movements that change lives and communities. In the years that followed, Maria completed her nursing degree and began working in the labor and delivery unit at the same hospital where Linda Chun worked. She specialized in supporting young mothers who were facing difficult circumstances, and she became known for her ability to provide both professional medical care and deep personal understanding of what it meant to be afraid and alone during one of life's most vulnerable moments. Isabella grew up, knowing that she was loved not only by her mother, but by a community of people who had supported her from before she was even born. She grew up understanding that kindness was not just a nice gesture, but a responsibility that people had toward each other. The GoFundMe campaign that had started with Linda Chun's simple desire to help a struggling mother eventually raised over $2 million. The excess funds, after ensuring Maria's long-term financial security and education, were used to establish a foundation that provided support for single mothers facing financial hardship while pursuing education or job training. Rose Martinez's scholarship program at Rosie's Diner helped dozens of women over the years, many of whom went on to successful careers and became advocates for other women facing similar challenges. Tom Bradley continued his volunteer work until he passed away peacefully at age 8, surrounded by many of the young fathers he had mentored over the years. At his funeral, Maria spoke about how his simple act of reaching into his wallet that day at the diner had been the spark that ignited a chain reaction of kindness that continued to grow years later. Father Miguel Rodriguez expanded his congregation's support programs to include job training, childcare assistance, and educational scholarships. The church became a model for faith-based community support that was replicated by religious organizations across the country. Linda Chun retired from nursing but continued to work with healthcare systems to develop programs that identified and supported patients facing financial hardship. She often told people that helping Maria had been the most meaningful experience of her career. The story of the pregnant waitress who worked until her last day continued to be shared and retold, inspiring new acts of kindness and community support. It became a touchstone for people who wanted to believe that compassion and generosity were still alive in the world. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Maria's story was the way it changed how people looked at the struggles around them. It reminded them to pay attention to the quiet courage of people who were doing their best in difficult circumstances. It encouraged them to ask questions, to offer help, and to understand that everyone's story was more complex and challenging than it appeared on the surface. Maria Santos had worked until the day she gave birth, not because she was superhuman, but because she was human. She was a person doing whatever it took to provide for someone she loved. Her story resonated because it reflected the sacrifices that people make for each other every day, often without recognition or support. The customers at Rosie's Diner who had spontaneously contributed money that day had not planned to change someone's life. They had simply responded to a need with whatever resources they had available. Their story resonated because it showed how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences in each other's lives. Linda Chun had not intended to create a viral fundraising campaign when she started the GoFundMe account. She had simply wanted to help someone who had touched her heart. Her story resonated because it demonstrated how one person's compassion could mobilize thousands of others to action. The story of Maria Santos became a story about all of us. It was about the struggles we face, the courage we find when we need it most, and the connections we make when we choose to see and respond to each other's humanity. Years later, when people asked Maria what she had learned from her experience, she would always give the same answer. I learned that we are all connected to each other in ways we don't always understand. I learned that there are people everywhere who care about the well-being of others, even strangers. And I learned that sometimes the most difficult moments in our lives are actually doorways to blessings we never could have imagined. Isabella, now a young woman herself, would often ask her mother to tell her the story of the day she was born and how it changed so many lives. Maria would always end the story the same way. You were born into a world that was ready to love you, even before you arrived. That's the kind of world I want you to help create for others. The legacy of the pregnant waitress, who worked until her last day, continues to inspire acts of kindness and community support. It serves as a reminder that behind every person we encounter is a story of struggle and hope, and that we all have the power to make a difference in each other's lives through simple acts of compassion and generosity. The story teaches us that heroism is not about dramatic gestures or superhuman abilities. Sometimes heroism is simply showing up for work when your body is telling you to rest, because you love someone more than you love your own comfort. Sometimes heroism is reaching into your wallet to help a stranger, even when you don't have much to give. Sometimes heroism is creating a fundraising campaign for someone you barely know, because you believe that everyone deserves support during their most difficult moments. The story of Maria Santos reminds us that we are all capable of extraordinary kindness, and that our small acts of compassion can create ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can imagine. It challenges us to pay attention to the people around us, to ask questions when something doesn't seem right, and to respond with generosity when we encounter need. Most importantly, it reminds us that none of us is alone in this world. There are people everywhere who are willing to help when they understand that help is needed. Sometimes all it takes is one person who is brave enough to ask for help and another person who is kind enough to give it. The pregnant waitress worked until her last day because she thought she had no choice. She discovered that she had an entire community ready to support her. She just hadn't known they were there. Her story encourages all of us to look around our own communities and ask who might need support, who might be struggling in silence, and how we can be part of the solution. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, the story of Maria Santos and the community that embraced her offers hope and inspiration. It reminds us that our shared humanity is stronger than our differences, and that kindness has the power to transform lives and communities in ways that nothing else can. The impact of Maria's story reached into corners of society that no one had anticipated. 3 years after Isabella's birth, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Williams reached out to Maria about creating a film that would explore the deeper implications of her story and its effect on American society. Sarah had been following the ongoing impact of Maria's story through social media and news reports. She had seen how the initial fundraiser had evolved into a permanent foundation, how policies had changed at various companies, and how communities across the country had implemented their own support programs inspired by Maria's experience. Your story represents something important about who we are as a society, Sarah explained to Maria during their first meeting. It shows both our failures and our capacity for redemption. It demonstrates what happens when we actually see each other and respond to that seeing with action. Maria was initially hesitant about participating in a documentary. She had always been a private person, and the attention from her story had sometimes felt overwhelming, but Sarah convinced her that the film could serve a greater purpose by inspiring systematic changes rather than just individual acts of kindness. The documentary, titled Until the Last Day, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later picked up by a major streaming platform. It featured interviews with Maria, Isabella, now a precocious 3-year-old, Linda Chun, Tom Bradley's family, Rose Martinez, Father Miguel Rodriguez, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the story. But the film also included policy experts, economists, and social workers who used Maria's experience as a case study in the inadequacies of America's social safety net. It explored how a wealthy nation could allow a pregnant woman to work until the moment she went into labor simply because she couldn't afford not to work. Dr. Amanda Foster, a professor of social policy at Arizona State University, appeared in the film to provide context about Maria's situation. Maria's story is not unique, Dr. Foster explained. There are thousands of pregnant women across this country who face similar impossible choices every day. The difference is that Maria's situation happened to be witnessed by people who had the resources and motivation to help. But what about all the other Marias who are struggling in silence? The documentary sparked national conversations about maternity leave policies, healthcare access, and support systems for vulnerable families. It led to congressional hearings on worker protections and inspired legislation in several states to improve benefits for pregnant workers. But perhaps more importantly, the film inspired the creation of what became known as Maria's List, a nationwide network of people who committed to actively looking for opportunities to support struggling families in their communities. The network operated through social media and local organizations, connecting people who needed help with people who were able to provide it. Marcus Thompson, a tech entrepreneur from Seattle, saw the documentary and was inspired to create an app called Community Care that allowed people to discreetly seek help for basic needs like rent, groceries, or childcare, and connected them with neighbors who were willing to provide assistance. The app was designed to preserve dignity by allowing anonymous requests and responses, removing the shame and awkwardness that often prevented people from asking for help. Within a year, Community Care was being used in over 200 cities across the United States. The app facilitated everything from grocery deliveries for new mothers to tutoring for children whose parents worked multiple jobs. It created micro-communities of support that operated on the same principles that had driven Maria's story: the understanding that everyone deserved help during difficult times, and that ordinary people had the power to make extraordinary differences in each other's lives. Maria became involved with community care as an advisor and spokesperson, helping to ensure that the app served people with dignity and respect. She often spoke at conferences and community events about the importance of creating systems that allowed people to both give and receive help without judgment. When I was pregnant and struggling, I felt like I was invisible, Maria would tell audiences. People saw me working, but they didn't see my fear or my desperation. The miracle wasn't just that people helped me when they finally understood my situation. The miracle was that they cared enough to look beyond the surface and ask the right questions. Isabella, now 4 years old, had become something of a local celebrity in Phoenix. People still recognized her when she and Maria went to Rosie's diner, and she had learned to wave politely at the strangers who wanted to meet the baby from the story. But Maria was careful to help Isabella understand that she was famous not for anything she had done, but because people had come together to help her family during a difficult time. Mama worked very hard when I was in her tummy, Isabella would explain to anyone who asked, repeating the age-appropriate version of the story that Maria had taught her. And lots of nice people helped us when I was born. That's why we help other people now. Indeed, helping others had become a central part of Maria and Isabella's life together. Every month, they volunteered at a local women's shelter, reading to children and helping with meal preparation. Isabella had learned to pack care packages for new mothers, including items like baby socks, pacifiers, and handwritten notes of encouragement. Maria's nursing career had flourished in ways she had never expected. She had specialized not only in labor and delivery, but also in patient advocacy, working with hospital social workers to identify families who might need additional support. She had developed a reputation for being able to spot the signs of financial stress or social isolation that often went unnoticed by other medical professionals. Maria has this incredible ability to see the whole person, not just the medical condition, explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the head of obstetrics at the hospital where Maria worked. She understands that a patient's social and economic circumstances are just as important as their physical health. She saves lives, not just through medical care, but through connecting people with the resources and support they need. Maria had also returned to school to pursue a master's degree in public health with a focus on maternal and child health policy. Her thesis project involved creating protocols for healthcare systems to systematically identify and support patients facing economic hardship. Several hospitals had already implemented versions of Maria's protocol, which trained staff to recognize signs of financial stress and connect patients with appropriate resources. The foundation that had been created from the excess funds from Maria's GoFundMe campaign had grown into a significant force for change. Under the guidance of a professional board of directors that included Linda Chun, Father Miguel Rodriguez, and several other community leaders, the foundation provided grants to organizations working to support pregnant women and new mothers. The foundation's signature program was called Circles of Care, which created support networks for pregnant women and new mothers who lacked family support systems. Each circle included a healthcare professional, a financial counselor, a peer mentor who had faced similar challenges, and several community volunteers who provided practical assistance like childcare, transportation, and meal preparation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher who studied the effectiveness of the Circles of Care program, found that participants were significantly less likely to experience postpartum depression, more likely to attend all their medical appointments, and more successful at breastfeeding compared to similar mothers who didn't participate in the program. What Maria's story taught us is that support needs to be comprehensive and sustained, Dr. Williams explained in her research report. It's not enough to provide financial assistance during a crisis. People need ongoing, emotional, practical, and social support to build stable, healthy lives for themselves and their children. The success of the Circles of Care program had attracted attention from policymakers and healthcare administrators across the country. Several states were piloting similar programs, and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services had commissioned a study to explore how the model might be scaled nationally. Rose Martinez, now 73 years old, had become something of a celebrity in the restaurant industry for her employee-friendly policies at Rosie's Diner. The paid maternity leave program she had implemented after Maria's experience had inspired other small business owners to reconsider their own benefits packages. Rose had been invited to speak at restaurant industry conferences about creating supportive workplaces, and she always used Maria's story as the centerpiece of her presentations. "I thought I was a good employer before Maria's situation opened my eyes," Rose would tell her audiences. "I paid fair wages. I treated my employees with respect, and I thought that was enough. But I learned that truly caring for your employees means paying attention to their lives outside of work and being prepared to provide support when they need it." Rosie's Diner had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for people who had followed Maria's story. The restaurant now displayed a small plaque near the booth where Maria had broken down and told Linda Chun about her situation. The plaque read, "In this booth, a community was born from compassion. May all who sit here be inspired to see and serve each other with kindness." Rose had also established what she called the Maria Santos Memorial Scholarship. Though Maria was very much alive, Rose insisted that the name honor the death of Maria's desperation and the birth of her hope. The scholarship provided financial support for single mothers pursuing education, and it had helped over 100 women in the 5 years since its inception. Tom Bradley's influence continued even after his death. His son, Michael Bradley, had taken up his father's volunteer work at the women's shelter and had established a mentorship program that connected older men in the community with young fathers who needed guidance and support. "My dad always said that helping Maria was the most important thing he ever did," Michael explained to a newspaper reporter on the 5th anniversary of Maria's story. "He didn't mean that his family wasn't important, or that his career didn't matter. He meant that reaching out to help a stranger when she needed it most was the most purely good thing he had ever done. He talked about it until the day he died." The mentorship program that Michael created in his father's honor had paired over 200 older men with younger fathers, creating relationships that often lasted for years. The program focused not just on practical parenting advice, but on emotional support and community building. Becoming a father can be overwhelming, especially if you don't have a good model from your own childhood, explained James Rodriguez, a 28-year-old participant in the program. "My mentor helped me understand that being a good dad isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up consistently and caring more about your child's well-being than your own comfort." Linda Chun, now retired from nursing, had written a book about her experience with Maria and the lessons she had learned about community building and compassion. The Courage to Care: How One Act of Kindness Changed Thousands of Lives became a bestseller and was frequently used in social work programs and community organizing courses. Linda's book explored not just Maria's story, but the psychological and social factors that prevented people from helping each other, and the conditions that made extraordinary acts of community support possible. Most people want to help others, but they don't know how to start, or they assume that someone else will take care of the problem, Linda wrote. Maria's story shows us that the most powerful form of help is simply paying attention to the people around us, being willing to ask questions when something doesn't seem right. Linda had become a popular speaker at conferences and community events, where she challenged audiences to identify opportunities for support in their own communities. She often ended her presentations with what became known as Linda's Challenge, asking audience members to commit to one specific act of community support within the following month. Father Miguel Rodriguez had used the attention from Maria's story to advocate for broader social justice initiatives within the Catholic Church. He had become a prominent voice in discussions about economic inequality and the Church's responsibility to address systemic issues that created poverty and hardship. Maria's story is a beautiful example of Christian charity in action. Father Rodriguez would preach, but it also challenges us to ask why charity was necessary in the first place. Why do we live in a society where a pregnant woman has to work until the moment she gives birth? What systems and policies need to change so that fewer families face these impossible choices? Father Rodriguez had established partnerships with other faith communities in Phoenix to create an interfaith coalition focused on supporting working families. The coalition provided everything from emergency financial assistance to advocacy for policy changes at the local and state level. The impact of Maria's story on corporate policy had been more significant than anyone had anticipated. Dozens of companies had reviewed and improved their maternity leave policies after learning about her situation. Some had gone beyond policy changes to create emergency assistance funds for employees facing unexpected hardships. Jennifer Walsh, the human resources director at a major tech company in California, explained how Maria's story had influenced her company's approach to employee support. "We realized that we had employees who were probably facing similar situations, but we had no systems in place to identify or help them. We created what we call a family support fund that provides emergency assistance for employees dealing with medical bills, housing crises, or other unexpected expenses." The Family Support Fund had assisted over 50 employees in its first year, preventing several families from falling into serious financial crises. Other companies had implemented similar programs, creating a trend toward more comprehensive employee support that went beyond traditional benefits packages. Educational institutions had also been influenced by Maria's story. Several nursing schools had incorporated her experience into their curricula, using it to teach students about the social determinants of health and the importance of patient advocacy. Dr. Susan Chun, no relation to Linda, a nursing professor at the University of Arizona, explained how Maria's story enhanced her teaching. When we talk about holistic patient care, Maria's story provides a concrete example of what that means in practice. It shows students that healing involves more than medical treatment. It requires attention to the social, economic, and emotional factors that affect a patient's well-being. The story had also influenced social work education, with several programs using Maria's experience as a case study in community organizing and mutual aid. Students learned to analyze how individual acts of kindness had evolved into systematic support systems, and how personal relationships could be leveraged to create broader social change. Psychology programs had also found Maria's story valuable for teaching about resilience, community psychology, and the factors that promote mental health during times of stress. Research studies had been conducted on the psychological impact of receiving unexpected community support, using Maria's experience as a foundation for understanding how social connections affect individual well-being. As Isabella entered kindergarten, Maria found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that frightening day when she had worked through contractions. Terrified about the future, Isabella was a confident, compassionate child who had grown up understanding that she was part of a community that cared about her well-being. The kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Patricia Johnson, was amazed by Isabella's maturity and kindness toward other children. Isabella has this remarkable ability to notice when other children are sad or struggling, Mrs. Johnson observed. She'll quietly get them a tissue, or invite them to play, or tell them that everything will be okay. It's like she has an instinctive understanding that people need to take care of each other. Maria wasn't surprised by Isabella's empathy. From her earliest days, Isabella had been surrounded by examples of kindness and community support. She had attended volunteer activities with her mother, met countless people who had contributed to their well-being, and grown up hearing stories about the importance of helping others. Isabella doesn't think of kindness as something special or unusual, Maria explained to Mrs. Johnson. To her, it's just how people are supposed to treat each other. She's never known a world where people don't care about each other's well-being. The kindergarten class had become involved in their own community service project, inspired by Isabella's example. They collected toys for the children's hospital, made cards for residents at a nursing home, and created care packages for new mothers at the women's shelter, where Maria and Isabella volunteered. Mrs. Johnson incorporated lessons about community and caring into the regular curriculum, using age-appropriate activities to teach the children about empathy, cooperation, and social responsibility. These children are learning that they have the power to make a difference in other people's lives. Mrs. Johnson explained to the parents during a class meeting, they're developing a sense of social responsibility that will serve them well throughout their lives. The influence of Maria's story had even reached into the business world in unexpected ways. A management consultant named David Kim had developed a training program for corporate leaders based on the principles demonstrated by the community that had supported Maria's story teaches us important lessons about leadership and organizational culture, David explained in his consulting work. The people who helped Maria didn't wait for someone else to take charge or solve the problem. They saw a need and responded immediately with whatever resources they had available. That's the kind of responsive, collaborative leadership that successful organizations need. David's consulting firm had worked with dozens of companies to implement what he called Maria's principles, actively seeking to understand the challenges faced by team members, responding quickly and generously when needs were identified, and creating systems that made it easy for people to both seek and provide help. The consulting work had led to measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, retention, and productivity at client companies. Workers reported feeling more supported and valued, and managers reported better communication and collaboration within their teams. When people feel genuinely cared for, they're more willing to contribute their best effort and more likely to care for others in return, David observed. Maria's story demonstrates how powerful it can be when people feel like they're part of a community that values their well-being. The ripple effects of Maria's story continued to expand in ways that surprised everyone involved. A group of high school students in Michigan had created a service club called the Maria Project, dedicated to identifying and supporting pregnant teenagers who were facing difficult circumstances. The club worked with school counselors and social workers to provide practical assistance like tutoring, childcare, and transportation to medical appointments. They also organized fundraising events to create emergency funds for students who needed help with basic necessities. Ashley Williams, the student who had founded the Maria Project, explained her motivation. "I heard Maria's story and realized that there might be girls right here in our school who were facing similar situations. We wanted to create a system where no one had to struggle alone." The Maria Project had helped over 30 pregnant students in its first 2 years, providing both practical assistance and emotional support. The program had been so successful that it was being replicated in schools across the country. College students had also been inspired by Maria's story to create their own support networks. Maria's Circle organizations had been established on dozens of college campuses, providing assistance for students who were parents, pregnant, or facing other significant challenges that affected their ability to succeed academically. These student-run organizations provided everything from emergency childcare to textbook, lending programs to meal assistance for students facing food insecurity. They operated on the same principles that had driven the response to Maria's situation, the understanding that everyone deserves support during difficult times, and that communities were strongest when they actively cared for their most vulnerable members. Professor Rachel Martinez at the University of Texas had studied the impact of campus Maria's Circle organizations and found that participating students had higher graduation rates and reported greater satisfaction with their college experience compared to similar students who didn't receive support. What we're seeing is that when students know they have a community that cares about their success, they're more likely to persist through challenges and more likely to succeed academically. Professor Martinez explained in her research report, "It's a powerful demonstration of how social support affects individual outcomes." The international impact of Maria's story had been unexpected but significant. Social media had carried the story around the world, inspiring similar support networks in countries across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. In Germany, a group called Maria's Neighbors had been established to support refugee mothers who were struggling to navigate new social and economic systems. In Japan, a similar organization provided assistance for single mothers facing cultural stigma and economic hardship. In Brazil, Círculo da Maria helped pregnant women in favelas access health care and social services. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher who studied international community support movements, had written extensively about the global influence of Maria's story. What's remarkable about Maria's story is how it translated across different cultures and social systems, Dr. Vasquez observed. The basic human needs that Maria faced, economic security, social support, and community connection, are universal. People around the world recognized their own struggles in her experience, and were inspired to create their own versions of the support she received. The international movement had led to academic conferences and policy discussions about community support systems as alternatives or supplements to government social services. Researchers were studying how grassroots mutual aid organizations could be sustained and scaled to address broader social challenges. As Maria's story entered its 6th year, she found herself in a position she had never anticipated, serving as an unofficial spokesperson for community-based support systems and mutual aid networks. She was frequently invited to speak at conferences, policy meetings, and community events about her experience and its broader implications. Maria had initially been reluctant to take on this public role, preferring to focus on her nursing career and raising Isabella. But she gradually came to understand that her story had become larger than her individual experience, and that she had a responsibility to use her platform to advocate for others facing similar challenges. "I never wanted to be famous," Maria would often tell audiences, "but if my story can help create systems that prevent other families from facing the fear and desperation I experienced, then I'm honored to share it." Maria's speaking engagements often focused on the importance of creating what she called cultures of care communities, where people actively looked out for each other's well-being and responded quickly and generously when needs were identified. "The miracle of my story wasn't that people helped me," Maria would explain. "The miracle was that they were paying attention enough to notice that I needed help. In too many communities, we're all so busy and distracted that we don't really see each other. We interact, but we don't connect. We're polite, but we're not caring." Maria would challenge her audiences to think about the difference between politeness and care, between individual kindness and community support, between charity and justice. "Individual acts of kindness are beautiful and important," Maria would say. "But lasting change requires systemic thinking. It requires creating conditions where fewer people face impossible choices, where support is available before crises occur, and where everyone has access to the resources they need to build stable, healthy lives."